On February 5, 2003, the world watched the UN Security Council. What they saw was Colin Powell, a 4-star general, a statesman, a figure whose integrity was his currency. He was spending it all to make the case for war, presenting what he was told was solid intelligence, mobile biolabs, a vial of simulated anthrax, held up for the cameras, a tangible symbol of an invisible threat. The intelligence, of course, was a catastrophic failure. No weapons were found. The source was a fabricator. The war would destabilize a region. Powell would later call it what it was, a permanent blot on his record. That pattern of leadership acting on disastrous intelligence is not history. Oh, it's happening again, right now. And the proof begins with one single impossible number, 220. That's the number of American soldiers and commanders Iran's military claims were killed or wounded in a single coordinated 24-hour assault. You watched that pattern 20 years ago in Iraq. Now the same playbook is running again. The official response from the Pentagon, echoed by the New York Times, quiet confirmation of just 6 to 8 deaths and minimal damage. The audit is real-time and public. Independent satellite imagery from Planet Labs, analysed by BBC Verify, shows the before US bases in Bahrain and Qatar intact. The after is brutal. Entire sections of those bases are gone, rubble, and the blackened scars of precision strikes that have vaporized hardened aircraft shelters and radar installations. One of these narratives is a lie. The official casualty count from the United States government, or the physical evidence carved into the earth, visible from space. This discrepancy is not just battlefield arithmetic. It's the footprint of a cover-up, strategic desperation inside an institution that cannot admit it's losing. The reason for a lie this big is not on the ground with the wreckage. It is circling at 30,000 feet over the Persian Gulf. A strategic asset built to turn a defeat into a wider catastrophe, waiting for orders. That signal, circling at 30,000 feet, has a name. A US Navy E-6B Mercury. On March 4th and 5th, 2026, open-source flight trackers watched it orbit over the Persian Gulf, an airborne nuclear command post in an active combat zone for the first time. This is not a bomber or a fighter. It is a nuclear command center. Its job is to keep command, control, and communications alive for America's nuclear forces if Washington and ground-based command nodes are destroyed. Inside, there are no windows onto the war below. Only green-lit consoles and a hiss of traffic from a battle-straining command. Oh, that crew isn't there to pose for cameras. You don't forward deploy your last resort nuclear command just to send a message. You put an E-6B over a live war when you think the conventional fight might not hold, and you need nuclear control to survive whatever breaks next. Someone in the chain of command has done that math. They've concluded conventional options are running out, and the nuclear option must sit within reach, not as theory in a briefing, but as a live branch in this war's decisions. Once nuclear command assets are in the theatre, the risk of a nuclear exchange stops being hypothetical. Decision times compress, misidentification, or a panicked order can pull multiple nuclear powers into the fallout of a war that began with bad intelligence. And the cover-up shifts, from hiding a failed conventional campaign to hiding how tightly nuclear weapons are now woven into the plan, and how thin the line is between conventional escalation and nuclear use. The deployment of a Doomsday Plane sends a signal far beyond a press release. For those of you who've studied or served in the military, what does that move tell you about the situation on the ground and in the command bunker? Share your analysis in the comments. But the most chilling validation of this reality isn't coming from inside the Pentagon. It's coming from two voices that almost never agree on anything. One in Beijing, and the other, a leading conservative in America. That voice from Beijing belonged to Victor Gao, a prominent analyst at the Center for China and Globalization. His assessment was not couched in diplomatic niceties. He warned publicly that the war was exposing American vulnerabilities, and that continued escalation risked a nuclear exchange with, in his words, no survivors. The United States, he said, must stop. Immediately. Within China's strategic community, Gao was not an outlier. His warning echoed broader analyses comparing any deeper US ground commitment to Vietnam and Afghanistan, quagmires that drained American power. In the United States, the echo came from the opposite end of the spectrum. On his network show, Tucker Carlson told viewers that further escalation could lead directly to a nuclear exchange, stressing that it was, quote, not off the table. He called the strikes disgusting and evil, language that cut straight across Washington's narrative of a clean, controlled operation. The math here is simple. When thinkers in Beijing and a leading American conservative voice land on the same risk profile, this is no longer political spin. You are looking at cross-adversary, cross-partisan alignment on one catastrophic possibility: escalation that ends in nuclear exchange. At that point, Washington's official story of a limited, successful operation wasn't just optimistic. It was isolated from the assessments accumulating around it. When your strategic rival and your vocal domestic critics are giving you the same warning, the rational move is to pull back, to start looking for an off-ramp. But backing down would also mean admitting the intelligence failure, the operational miscalculation, and the damage to American deterrence this war was revealing. In that kind of environment, desperation creates its own dark logic. And in Washington, leadership was about to consider a move of breathtaking insanity. The next move on the table was a ground deployment, or more accurately, the appearance of one. As the air campaign stalled in plain view, and with warnings from key allies and international institutions already on record, the rational path was de-escalation. But in Washington, political survival demanded a visible show of strength, no matter how far it drifted from the underlying military reality. That week, NBC News reported that President Trump had privately asked about a limited ground option inside Iran. Their sources said he was seriously considering sending a small contingent of US ground troops across the border, roughly 5,000 soldiers likely drawn from the 82nd Airborne Division's Rapid Reaction Force. Let's map the math. 5,000 soldiers against a prepared, motivated nation of nearly 90 million people on its home turf. At best, a force that's small can secure a few points on the map. It cannot impose terms on an entire state that size. This wasn't a strategy for victory. It was a domestic political signal dressed up as an operational plan, with the casualty risk pushed to the margins. The world expected Iran to issue threats, protests, formal condemnations. Instead, what came from Tehran was something far more chilling, an invitation. Iranian official Abbas Araghchi stated publicly that their military was waiting for this. He didn't bluster. He spoke with the cold confidence of someone looking at a prepared kill zone. Defenses already mapped out, fields of fire planned, the likely American losses treated as a known variable, saying this would be a big disaster for America. His message was clear. Bring your soldiers. We have been preparing for this for decades. Come. In that exchange, the power imbalance was impossible to miss. On one side, a leadership class discounting its own intelligence and basic force ratios to avoid admitting failure. On the other, a state that had spent 40 years practicing strategic patience, shaping doctrine and defenses for exactly this scenario. This level of miscalculation carries a cost not measured in soldiers, but in alliances. America's most critical partners in the region were about to deliver their own verdict, and it would signal the beginning of the end for a 50-year security architecture. The verdict didn't come through diplomatic channels. It arrived as streaks of fire over Dubai. Iran's thousand cuts strategy was now fully visible. Not a symmetric war, but an economic attrition campaign. The targets were not just military bases, but the crown jewels of Gulf economies, with missiles landing near Palm Jumeirah and the Burj Al Arab, global billboards for permanence. Dubai International Airport, one of the world's main crossroads for capital, halted operations. In an economy built on transit, the engine of the UAE's growth stalled. In Qatar, missile defenses lit the sky as interceptors chased warheads targeting Al Udeid Air Base, a linchpin of American power. Inside the main terminal, passengers watched departure boards flip from scheduled to cancelled as regional flight schedules unravelled, taking business trips and tourism with them. As analysts at the Stimson Center would later note, it was America's own allies who carried the heaviest economic cost. Flight chaos, a collapse in tourism bookings, and disruption to regional trade. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's oil artery, grew quiet, not with peace, but with shipping through the strait becoming effectively uninsurable and with pressure shifting from runways and harbors to palaces and cabinet rooms. For decades, these Gulf states had built their prosperity under the American security umbrella. It kept risk premia low and capital flowing. Now US bases that once guaranteed stability had become aiming points for fire on their financial centers and to insurers and sovereign wealth funds. The American presence no longer reduced risk, it defined it. The trajectory was clear. Keep hosting US forces, and the cost of capital, costs, and the probability of another strike would rise until the alliance on paper had become a fatal liability. Once that math was accepted, choices narrowed fast. It is rare for client states to ask a superpower to take its forces and go, rarer still in the middle of a war, fought in their name. Yet behind closed doors, that is what happened. The same allies Washington claimed to be protecting began to demand that their protector, the United States military, leave the region. A battlefield cover-up, a nuclear alert, the abandonment of allies. We have seen the cascading failures. Now we trace it all back to the source, to the original sin of this war. The single catastrophic intelligence assessment that started it all, so we trace it all back to the source. Inside that secure briefing room, a single CIA Mossad PowerPoint slide carries the title, High Confidence, Popular Uprising Following Strike. Stamped with the system's strongest label, that prediction is treated as fact and clears the way for war. The logic was brutally simple. A precision decapitation strike against the supreme leader would shatter the regime's authority. The Iranian people, the assessment guaranteed, would flood the streets in celebration, welcoming a new order. Senior decision-makers in Washington and Jerusalem treated that high confidence as a promise, not a probability, and used it as the decisive justification to authorize the strike. It was supposed to be a swift, clean collapse. Reality was quieter and far more resilient. There was no uprising. The streets did not fill with flags and cell phone cameras. The next morning in Tehran, shopkeepers in the bazaars rolled up their metal shutters, commuters sat in traffic, and traders opened their terminals as if nothing had changed. Across the country, people went to work, markets opened, and the state revealed itself to be something more than a single point of failure. The entire decapitation strategy was flawed because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the target. In the internal reviews that followed, one assessment finally said out loud what the war had already proven: Iran's command structure is decentralized and built to absorb shocks. You cannot, an analyst told colleagues, decapitate a hydra. That briefing room slide is the war's original sin. A single falsifiable prediction about a jubilant uprising, now disproven in the most public way possible, became the foundation for a conflict whose costs now include a nuclear standoff and a grinding drain on Western power. It is not just an eerie echo of the Iraq-Wemdy fiasco. It is the same institutional pathology. Despite a Senate Intelligence Committee report spelling out how wishful thinking and bad data drove the last disaster, the machinery was allowed to run the same play again. And the pattern always ends the same way. Intelligence failure feeds a mispriced war. The war feeds structural economic shocks, energy volatility, disrupted trade routes, fractured alliances, rising defense outlays. And those shocks eventually reprice risk across currencies, equities, debt, and real assets. This case is no different. This intelligence failure is not a historical footnote. It functions as an invoice drawn on your balance sheet. In the next chapter, we will walk through the math on how that one bad slide bleeds purchasing power out of your portfolio, and the math is precise and unforgiving. The math begins with the first order effect. The closure of an economic artery, the Strait of Hormuz. As the conflict escalates, that channel becomes effectively uninsurable for commercial shipping, and nearly 20% of global oil supply is taken offline. Watch this line on your screen, the price of crude oil. See it jump 25%, breaking above 90 a barrel on the day the strait is effectively closed. Federal Reserve research suggests a sustained $10 rise in oil can add roughly 0.2 percentage points to inflation and shave about 0.1 points off GDP. Classic stagflation risk. Meanwhile, the unacknowledged cost of the war is approaching $1 billion a day in missiles, drones, and ordnance. An economic attrition machine that balloons the national debt and locks in higher interest costs for years. It's the same dynamic that took the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to more than $8 trillion in total cost, as Brown University's Costs of War project found. Shift to the second line. This is inflation. It follows the oil price on a delay. That is the hidden bill for the war, showing up in your portfolio as a stealth tax on your savings and investments. As that line grinds higher, every dollar you hold buys less. If yields on your cash and bonds don't keep up, your real returns turn negative and your existing wealth is quietly written down. Intelligence failures lock Washington into a war it is not winning against Iran. Rather than admit that, leaders escalate. More sorties, more ordnance, more pressure on Iran's energy and shipping. The escalation turns the Strait of Hormuz into a contested, effectively closed energy choke point. That choke point drives oil higher, pushes inflation up, and forces war spending into a swelling debt pile financed at higher yields or later repaid through heavier taxes and financial repression. The mechanism that erodes the wealth you spent a lifetime building. It is a direct mechanical causal chain from the battlefield to your balance sheet. This sequence, from flawed intelligence to political denial to a bill ultimately paid by the public, is not an anomaly. It's the same pattern that funded the post-9/11 wars, and it's funding this one again. Recognizing that echo of history beneath these charts is the final step to positioning yourself correctly. If you've had the feeling you've seen this movie before, it's because you have. This intelligence catastrophe, this political refusal to admit error, It perfectly replicates the sunk cost dynamics of Vietnam and of Iraq. Inside the system, the loop is always the same. Once political ego locks in at the top, admitting the initial premise was catastrophically wrong is off the table. So instead of cutting losses, they sign off on more deployments and supplemental war budgets, letting interest costs stack on top of a failing bet. Add the direct war appropriations to the debt used to fund them, and the long-term economic drag, and the wars in Vietnam and Iraq, both launched on faulty intelligence, cost the US economy up to $8 trillion. For years, you saw it in whipsawing energy prices, and in index sell-offs around each escalation. Portfolio damage traced straight back to military overstretch and commodity volatility. The names change. The dates change. But the script remains the same. And if you've watched your savings or business get dragged through each intervention, you know it. The bill never lands where the decision was made. The people paying that cost are not the people making the decision. They never are. They never are. It shows up instead in your tax line, in muted returns, in fewer options for your kids, slow, compounding losses that never make a press conference. If you can see that pattern forming early, you can position before those costs are fully priced in. To keep connecting the dots between geopolitical decisions and your portfolio, subscribe and enable notifications.